The wedding venue was alive with energy, a swirl of music and laughter that filled every corner of the grand hall I'd spent months helping my son, Callan, pick out. I could still remember the late-night calls, the endless lists of vendors we narrowed down together, and the way I'd stayed up crunching numbers to make sure the catering and half the decorations were covered without a hitch. I stood off to the side in my tailored suit, the one I'd saved up for just for today, watching the crowd mingle under the soft glow of chandeliers. No one really noticed me, which wasn't new, but it stung more than usual. My eyes drifted to the head table, where the real weight of the day hit me like a punch. There she was, Miriam, my ex-wife, practically glowing with pride, her hand clasped tightly in her new husband Gerald's. They looked like they belonged there, like they'd always been the ones steering this ship. Next to Callan and his bride were name cards for them, for Miriam's sister, even for their scruffy little dog. But me? Nothing. Not a single marker with my name. Not even a nod to the man who'd poured everything into this moment. I felt my chest tighten as I walked toward the table, my polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Callan saw me coming, his face flickering with something. Guilt, maybe, or just annoyance. Before I could even open my mouth, he leaned back in his chair, that forced smile of his cutting deeper than any words could. "Come on, Dad," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You always liked staying in the background. You're just back where you belong." The words landed heavy, each one a reminder of every compromise, every quiet sacrifice I'd made to keep peace. I could have argued, could have pointed out the checks I'd written or the nights I'd stayed up planning. But what was the point? The room was full of people, but I'd never felt more alone. My hand slipped into my coat pocket, fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the small box I'd brought with me. I didn't plan to do it, not really, but something in me snapped, not loud, not angry, just final. I pulled the box out, set it gently on the table right in front of him, and turned away. No words, no scene. Just the soft clink of wood against the tablecloth as I walked toward the exit. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, the music fading behind me. I didn't look back, didn't need to. I could imagine the confusion on Callan's face, maybe Miriam's quick glance to see what I'd done. That box wasn't much to look at. Small, plain, nothing fancy, but it held more than they'd ever expect. Years of truth I'd kept locked away, not for my sake, but for theirs. I'd paid for this night, for the flowers and the food in the open bar everyone was enjoying, but I wasn't going to beg for a seat at their table. Not anymore. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, a modest sedan that didn't turn heads, just like me. I slid into the driver's seat, my hands steady on the wheel despite the ache in my chest. I'd spent years building moments like this for my son, thinking one day he'd see me for who I was. But tonight, he'd made it clear he didn't. The box was my last word, not to hurt him, but to let him know I wasn't invisible. Not entirely. Driving home, the road stretched out dark and quiet, the kind of silence that makes you think too much. I kept replaying his words, that cold edge in his voice, the way he didn't even flinch when he said it. I'd always been the one to step back, to let Miriam take the spotlight, to keep things smooth for the kids. Maybe that was my mistake, thinking silence was strength. The box wasn't just for Callan, it was for me, too. A way to stop hiding. I didn't know what he'd do when he opened it, if he'd even care enough to look inside. Maybe he'd toss it aside, laugh it off with his new wife, or let Miriam spin it into another story about how I was the problem. But as I pulled into my driveway, the house dark and empty, I felt something shift. Not relief, not yet, but a kind of clarity. I'd done my part, more than my part. Now it was up to them to deal with what I'd left behind. The suit jacket came off as I stepped inside, the weight of the day settling into my bones. I poured a glass of water, not bothering with anything stronger, and sat at the kitchen table. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that reminds you no one's coming home. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to be the good guy, the one who didn't make waves. I'd paid for school trips, fixed Callan's first car, sat through every game and graduation, even when I knew I wasn't welcome. And for what? To be told I belonged in the shadows? My fingers tapped the table, restless. The box wasn't a bomb, wasn't meant to destroy him. It was just the truth, raw, unfiltered, the kind I'd never had the guts to lay bare before. I didn't know if he'd open it tonight, tomorrow, or ever, but I'd carried it long enough. For once, I wasn't the one who had to wait for answers. The moment that small wooden box touched the table, it was like the air in the room shifted, even if no one else noticed. I didn't stick around to see their reactions. Callan's confusion, Miriam's inevitable frown, or the curious glances from the wedding guests. My shoes echoed on the polished floor as I walked out of the venue, the music and laughter fading into a dull hum behind me. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the night air cool against my face, and kept moving toward my car. I didn't look back. There was no point. Inside that plain little box was everything I'd held onto for years. Papers, truths, pieces of a life I'd kept hidden to protect my kids. I wasn't sure if Callan would even open it, but the weight of it was off my shoulders now. I'd carried it long enough. My sedan sat at the far end of the lot, unassuming as ever, and I slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking under me. The engine started with a low rumble, and I pulled onto the road, the lights of the venue shrinking in my rearview mirror. Driving home, the quiet of the night wrapped around me, broken only by the hum of the tires. My phone buzzed in my pocket, then again and again, until it was a steady vibration I couldn't ignore. I didn't check it. Not yet. I knew who it'd be. Callan, probably. Or maybe Miriam, demanding to know what I'd done, why I'd left. Maybe even Tessa, my daughter, wondering why I'd made a scene. But I hadn't made a scene, had I? I'd just set down a box and walked away. No shouting, no speeches, just silence. That's what I'd always done, stayed silent, let things slide, kept the peace. And where had it gotten me? Erased from my own son's wedding. No name card, no seat, just a pat on the back for staying in the background. The words he'd said still burned, sharp and cold, like a blade I hadn't seen coming. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles pale in the dashboard light. I wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something deeper, something that sat heavy in my chest, like grief for a version of my family I'd never get back. The phone kept buzzing, relentless now. I pulled into a gas station halfway home, the neon sign casting a harsh glow over the empty lot. I finally reached for the phone, the screen lighting up with notifications, texts, missed calls, voicemails. Callan's name popped up first. Dad, what was that? Call me. Then another. Seriously, what's in the box? Miriam's message was colder. That was unnecessary. You upset him. Tessa's was just a question mark, like she didn't know where to start. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but I didn't type anything. What was there to say? I'd spent years explaining myself, justifying every choice, every sacrifice, and it hadn't changed a thing. The box was my answer now. Let them figure it out. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and got back on the road, the station's lights fading behind me. The drive felt longer than usual, the dark stretching out like it was trying to swallow me whole. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked smaller somehow, the porch light flickering like it was on its last legs. I cut the engine and sat there for a minute, listening to the silence settle in. The phone buzzed again, but I left it where it was. Inside, the house was as empty as I'd left it, the kind of quiet that makes every creak louder than it should be. I kicked off my shoes, the suit jacket already draped over a chair, and sank onto the couch. The box was out there now, sitting on that fancy table I'd paid for, surrounded by people who'd never really seen me. I could picture it. Callan picking it up, maybe, turning it over in his hands, wondering if it was worth opening. Or maybe Miriam snatched it first, her voice low and sharp, telling him it was nothing, just another one of my stunts. I didn't know, and for once, I didn't care. I'd done my part. The catering, the decorations, the late-night talks when he was stressed about the guest list, all of it. Paid for, planned, handled. And still, I was the ghost at the party. I got up and grabbed a glass from the kitchen, filling it with water from the tap. The cold felt good against my throat, grounding me. My eyes wandered to the fridge, where a photo of Callan and Tessa from years ago was still stuck under a magnet, a camping trip, back when they'd still laugh at my bad jokes. They were so small then, so easy to make happy. I'd thought being a dad meant giving everything, no questions asked. I'd worked overtime to cover Callan's college, driven hours for Tessa's dance recitals, nodded along when Miriam rewrote our history to make herself the hero. Also, they'd never have to pick sides. But tonight, Callan had picked one, and it wasn't mine. The box wasn't revenge, it wasn't even about him, not really. It was about me finally saying, I was here. I'd kept those documents for years, not to hurt anyone. but because letting them go felt like letting go of the truth. Receipts, letters, proof of everything I'd done. It was all in there, waiting for someone to care enough to look. The phone buzzed again on the coffee table, the screen flashing in the dark. I ignored it and leaned back, closing my eyes. The wedding was probably winding down now, guests stumbling to their cars, the band packing up. I wondered if Callan was still holding the box, or if he'd shoved it in a bag to deal with later. Maybe he'd open it tonight, maybe not. Either way, it wasn't my burden anymore. I'd funded the party, raised the groom, loved him even when it hurt. If that wasn't enough, then nothing would be. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to fix it. The silence I'd always leaned into wasn't weakness now, it was power. I'd spoken without saying a word, and whatever came next, I was done waiting for permission to matter. The house was dark when I got home that night, the kind of quiet that seeps into your bones and makes you feel smaller than you are. I didn't bother turning on too many lights, just the lamp in the living room, casting a soft glow over the worn couch where I sank down, still in my suit from the wedding. My mind kept drifting back to Callan's words, the way he looked at me like I was an afterthought, telling me I belonged in the background. It wasn't just the sting of last night that hurt. It was the weight of years piling up behind it. Years I'd spent thinking if I just kept showing up, kept giving, my kids would see me for who I was. But they hadn't, and I couldn't stop thinking about how it all started, 15 years ago, when everything I thought I knew about family fell apart. Back then, I wasn't ready to face how deep the cracks went, but sitting here now, alone in this empty house, it was impossible not to trace the path that led me to that moment at the wedding, to that box I'd left on the table. 15 years ago, Miriam walked out. Not just out of our marriage, but out of the life we'd built together, taking most of it with her. I still remember the day she told me about Gerald, her voice calm, like she was discussing the weather, saying she'd found someone who understood her better. Gerald, with his slick smile and expensive watch, wasn't just charming. He was calculated, the kind of guy who knew how to make promises that sounded good but never held up. I didn't fight her when she asked for the divorce, didn't argue when she took the house, the savings, even the photo albums I'd spent years putting together. I thought if I stayed quiet, it'd be easier for Callan and Tessa, who were just teenagers then, caught in the middle of something they didn't deserve. But Miriam didn't stop at taking things. She took their trust in me, too, bit by bit, with stories I never got the chance to counter. She'd tell them I was too busy, too distant, too focused on work, and I let her because I didn't want them to hate her. I thought truth would win out eventually. I was wrong about that. Every weekend I got with the kids, I tried to make it count. I'd pick them up in my old pickup, the one Callan used to love riding in, and we'd go for ice cream or to the park, even when they were too old for swings. I showed up to every school event, every parent-teacher conference, even when Miriam and Gerald were there, acting like they were the ones who'd helped with homework or driven to practices. I'd sit in the back, clapping for Callan's soccer games or Tessa's dance recitals, knowing my name wasn't on the program, knowing I'd get a quick wave at best. I took it all, the awkward silences, the half-hearted hugs, because I thought it was enough to just be there. I never told them about the second job I picked up to cover Callan's college tuition, the one that had me hauling deliveries at night after my day shift. I didn't mention the weekends I spent fixing up the small apartment I moved into after the divorce, trying to make it a place they'd want to visit. I kept my mouth shut, thinking one day they'd ask, one day they'd see it for themselves. Callan was the hardest hit when Miriam left. He was 14, angry at the world, and I tried to be the one he could lean on. He'd call me late at night sometimes, voice shaking, saying he didn't want to stay with his mom anymore. I'd listen, tell him I loved him, but I never pushed to take him away from her. I couldn't do that to him, couldn't make him choose. Tessa was different. She adapted, got quiet, but she still smiled when I'd bring her favorite snacks or take her to the library. I thought I was doing right by them, keeping the peace, letting Miriam spin her stories while I stayed steady. But over time, the visits got shorter, the calls less frequent. By the time Callan was in college, I was lucky to get a text on my birthday. I paid for his tuition, every dime, without a word about it, because that's what dads do. I thought he'd notice someday, maybe when he was older, maybe when he had kids of his own. But last night, standing at that head table with no place for me, I realized he hadn't noticed. Neither had Tessa. They'd bought Miriam's version of the story, the one where I was the one who checked out, not the one who stayed. I got up from the couch, my legs stiff, and walked to the kitchen. The fridge hummed softly, the only sound in the house. I opened it, staring at nothing in particular, just needing something to do. There was a magnet holding up a photo of Callan and Tessa from years ago, their faces smudged with dirt from a camping trip. I'd taught them how to build a fire that weekend, and Callan had laughed so hard when I burned the marshmallows. That was before Gerald, before the divorce, before I became the guy in the background. I closed the fridge and leaned against the counter, my hands gripping the edge. I'd never contested Miriam's lies, never told the kids about the nights I'd stayed up worrying about them, the money I'd scraped together, the choices I'd made to keep them safe. I thought love meant staying quiet, but all it did was make me invisible. That box I'd left wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about finally being seen, even if it was too late. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, the house still heavy with silence. I didn't check my phone, didn't want to see the messages piling up. I'd spent 15 years trying to be the bigger person, thinking it'd pay off, thinking my kids would come around. But last night, Callan had looked right through me, like I was nothing more than a guest at his wedding, not the man who'd made it possible. I wasn't sure what he'd do with the box, if he'd even care enough to open it. Maybe it'd sit unopened, gathering dust somewhere. Or maybe it'd shake something loose, make him ask questions he'd never asked before. Either way, I was done waiting for him to figure it out. I'd given everything I had, and it hadn't been enough. Now, for the first time in years, I felt like I didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not Callan, not Tessa, not Miriam. I'd laid my truth bare, and whatever came next wasn't mine to carry anymore. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to sunlight creeping through the blinds, the kind of soft glow that makes everything feel new for a moment before reality settles back in. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, my suit from last night still slung over a chair in the corner. The house was quiet, same as always, but my mind wouldn't stop turning. I kept thinking about that box, small, plain, nothing special to look at, but heavy with everything I'd kept locked away for years. I'd placed it on Callan's table without a word, walked out, and left it there like a stone dropped in still water. I didn't know if he'd opened it yet, if he'd even touched it, but the thought of it sitting there, waiting, was enough to make my chest feel tight. That box wasn't just a thing. It was me, all the pieces of myself I'd buried to keep my kids from hurting. Now it was out there, and there was no taking it back. I got up, my joints creaking a little more than they used to, and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee. The routine felt grounding: scoop the grounds, fill the pot, wait for the familiar gurgle. But even as I moved through it, my thoughts kept drifting to what was inside that box. It had been in my safe for years, tucked behind old tax returns and a couple of faded photos I couldn't bring myself to throw out. I hadn't planned to use it, not really. It was more like a safety net, something to remind myself I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the sacrifices I'd made. But last night, when Callan looked at me like I was nothing, when I saw my name missing from that table, something in me said enough. I couldn't keep carrying it alone anymore. The coffee maker beeped, and I poured a mug, the steam curling up as I leaned against the counter, picturing every item I'd tucked inside that wooden case. There were receipts first, dog-eared, notarized copies of every payment I'd made for Callan's college, the ones I'd covered with late-night shifts at the warehouse. I'd never told him about those, never wanted him to feel like he owed me. Then there was a check, $20,000, uncashed, from Miriam years ago. She'd sent it after the divorce, a gesture she called for appearance's sake, like my pride was something she could buy off. I kept it, not to cash it, but because it was proof of who she was, someone who thought money could erase what she'd done. There was an email, too, one she'd accidentally sent to me instead of Gerald, laying out how they'd make sure I was invisible at the wedding, how they'd spin the story so Callan wouldn't question my absence from the spotlight. Reading it back then had felt like a kick to the gut, but I'd saved it, printed it, and filed it away, telling myself it didn't matter. I was wrong about that, too. The most important thing in there, though, was a letter, a single sheet of lined paper, folded carefully, written in Callan's messy teenage handwriting. He was 14 when he wrote it, after a blowout fight with Miriam. I'd found it slipped under my apartment door one night, his words spilling out raw and desperate, begging to come live with me, saying he couldn't stand being with her anymore. I'd held on to it, read it so many times the creases were soft, but I never used it. Not in court, not in arguments, not even when he started pulling away from me. I didn't want to win him like that, didn't want him to feel like he had to pick a side. I thought keeping it secret was the right thing, that it'd protect him from more pain. But last night, when he told me I belonged in the background, I realized he'd never know unless I showed him. That letter was the heart of the box, the piece I hoped would make him see me, not just as his dad, but as the guy who'd chosen him over everything, even when it cost me. I sipped my coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and glanced at the clock. It was barely 8, but I knew the wedding fallout was probably already in full swing. My phone was still on the coffee table where I'd left it last night, the screen dark but likely full of messages I wasn't ready to read. I didn't want to hear Callan's excuses or Miriam's accusations, not yet. The box was my voice now, saying what I'd never had the guts to say out loud. I wondered what Callan thought when he saw it, if he'd picked it up, turned it over, maybe felt the weight of it. Did he open it right there at the reception? Or was it still sitting on the table, ignored? I could picture Miriam's face, her quick smile to cover any unease, telling everyone it was nothing, just another one of my quirks. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything, every late night, every missed opportunity, every time I bit my tongue to keep the peace. I set the mug down and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside to look at the street outside. The neighborhood was quiet, just a guy walking his dog, the world moving on like nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. That box wasn't about revenge or settling scores. It was about letting go. I'd spent years holding on to those papers, that letter, thinking they'd stay locked away forever. But when I saw my name missing from that table, when Callan dismissed me like I was nobody, I knew I couldn't keep hiding. Not for him, not for Tessa, not for anyone. The box was my way of saying I'd been there, even when they didn't see me, even when they chose not to look. I didn't know if Callan would read that letter and feel something, regret, maybe, or just confusion, or if he'd toss it aside like it didn't matter. Either way, it wasn't my job to make him understand anymore. The coffee was cold now, but I didn't care. I sat back on the couch, my eyes landing on a shelf across the room where a small wooden carving sat. A fish Callan had made in shop class years ago. He'd given it to me, proud as anything, and I'd kept it there ever since. I wondered if he even remembered making it, if he'd ever thought about the hours we'd spent together back then, before everything got complicated. The box was my last gift to him, not the kind you wrap in shiny paper, but the kind that forces you to look at what's real. I'd protected him from the truth for too long, thinking it'd keep him safe. Now it was his to deal with, and I was done carrying the weight alone. Whatever happened next, I'd said my piece, not with words, but with a small wooden box that held more than he'd ever know. The sun was barely up when I woke the next morning, the kind of gray dawn that feels like it's holding its breath. I hadn't slept much, just a few restless hours of drifting in and out. My mind stuck on that box I'd left at Callan's wedding. I could still feel the smooth wood under my fingers, the soft clink as it hit the table, the way the room seemed to pause for a split second before I turned and walked out. I didn't know if he'd opened it, if he'd even looked at it, but the thought of it out there, waiting, kept me on edge. I got out of bed, the floor cold under my feet, and went through the motions, coffee, toast, the usual routine. But nothing felt usual. My phone had been buzzing off and on since last night, a steady stream of texts and voicemails I hadn't touched. I knew they were from Callan, maybe Tessa, probably Miriam, all wanting answers I wasn't ready to give. I'd said what I needed to with that box. Now it was their turn to deal with it. By mid-morning, the messages were piling up, lighting up the screen every few minutes. I glanced at the phone on the kitchen counter, saw Callan's name flash, then Tessa's, then Miriam's, each one like a jab I wasn't ready to take. I let them stack up, unanswered, and tried to focus on something else. I cleaned the dishes, wiped down the counters, even pulled some weeds from the small patch of yard out front, but my head wasn't in it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Callan's face from the wedding, that cold smile when he told me I belonged in the background. I saw Miriam's hand in Gerald's, the head table with no place for me, the years of keeping quiet so my kids wouldn't have to choose. That box was my line in the sand, and I wasn't sure if I'd crossed it or just burned the ground behind me. Either way, there was no going back. It was late afternoon when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I was in the living room, flipping through an old book I wasn't really reading, when the engine cut off and footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. I knew it was Tessa before I even heard the knock, sharp, quick, like she was too worked up to wait. I opened the door, and there she was, her face a mix of anger and hurt, as red like she'd been crying. She didn't wait for an invitation, just stepped inside, her purse slung over one shoulder, her voice already sharp. "Why would you do that?" she said, not quite yelling but close. "Why would you ruin his wedding like that? You just left that thing on the table and walked out. Do you know how embarrassed he was?" I stood there, letting her words hit me, feeling the weight of them but not buckling. I'd heard this tone before, the one that assumed I was the one who'd messed up, but this time I wasn't going to nod and take it. "Did you look in the box?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, low. She froze, her mouth half open like she hadn't expected me to push back. "Did you?" I repeated, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. She shook her head, just a small jerk, and looked away, her fingers tightening on the strap of her purse. "Then you don't know what you're talking about," I said, not cruel, just matter of fact. I walked to the couch and sat down, motioning for her to follow. She hesitated, then came over, perching on the edge like she might bolt any second. I didn't rush her. I just waited, letting the silence stretch until she finally spoke again, softer this time. "What's in it, Dad? Why is it such a big deal?" I leaned forward, my hands clasped between my knees, and looked her in the eye. "Go get it," I said. "It's at Callan's. Look inside, then come back and tell me I ruined anything." She didn't move right away, just stared at me like she was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't. After a long minute, she stood, grabbed her purse, and headed for the door. "I'll be back," she muttered, like it was a warning. I nodded and watched her go, the car kicking up dust as she pulled out. The house went quiet again, but it didn't feel as heavy this time. I knew what was coming. Tessa was stubborn, but she was fair. She'd look, she'd see, and she'd have to face what I'd kept hidden all these years. I got up and poured another coffee, the pot still warm, and sat at the kitchen table, waiting. The clock ticked on, slow and steady, and I let my mind wander back to the box, to the letter inside it, the one Callan wrote when he was 14, begging to live with me. I'd never shown it to anyone, not even him, but I'd kept it like a lifeline, proof that he'd seen me once, even if he didn't anymore. It was dark by the time Tessa came back. The knock was softer this time, hesitant. I opened the door, and she stood there, the box in her hands, her face pale and her eyes wide. She looked like she'd been hit by something she didn't see coming. "You kept this," she whispered, holding up the letter, her voice shaking. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She sat on the couch, the box on her lap, and started pulling things out, receipts, the check, the email, all of it. She read the letter again, her fingers tracing the words like they might disappear. "He wrote this, and you never told us," she said, not angry now, just lost. I sat across from her, my hands folded, and told her the truth, how I'd never wanted them to hate their mom, how I thought keeping quiet would keep them safe. She listened, tears slipping down her cheeks, and for the first time in years, I felt like she was really seeing me. We talked for hours, longer than we had in ages. She asked questions, hard ones, about why I'd let Miriam rewrite our story, why I'd paid for so much without saying a word. I didn't have all the answers, just the truth, that I'd loved them too much to make them choose. When she left, the box still in her hands, she hugged me, tight and real, like she used to when she was little. I didn't know what Callan would do when he saw it, if he'd feel the same, but Tessa's tears were enough for now. The truth was out, cracking the surface of everything they'd been told, and I wasn't invisible anymore, not to her, at least. I closed the door behind her, the house quiet again, but lighter somehow, like I'd finally let go of something I'd carried too long. The days after Tessa's visit felt different, like the air in the house wasn't so heavy anymore. I went through my routines, coffee in the morning, work at the hardware store, dinner alone at the kitchen table, but my mind kept circling back to that box and what it had started. Tessa had seen the truth, held it in her hands, and for the first time in years, I felt like one of my kids understood me, even if it was just a little. But Callan was another story. He hadn't reached out since the wedding, not after the flurry of texts I'd ignored that night. I didn't know if he'd opened the box, if Tessa had shown him the letter, or if he was too caught up in his new life to care. I tried not to dwell on it, but every time my phone stayed silent, I wondered if I'd pushed him too far, if that small wooden box had broken something we'd never fix. Still, I didn't regret it. I'd spent too long hiding, and I was done letting his version of me be the one Miriam had painted. It was a Thursday evening, almost a week later, when I heard a knock at the door. I was in the living room, half watching some old movie on TV, the kind with too much noise and not enough story. The knock was soft, not like Tessa's sharp raps, and I knew before I stood up who it'd be. My stomach twisted as I crossed the room, my hand pausing on the doorknob for just a second before I opened it. Callan stood there, his jacket zipped up against the chilly night, his face drawn and tired. He didn't look angry, not like I'd expected. He looked broken, like something inside him had cracked open, and he didn't know how to hold it together. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. I nodded, stepping aside, and he walked past me, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying more than just the cold. He didn't sit right away, just stood in the middle of the living room, hands shoved in his pockets, staring at the floor. I closed the door and leaned against it, waiting. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, but I didn't break it. I'd said my piece with the box, now it was his turn. Finally, he looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw the weight of it all there. The wedding, the years, everything. I read the letter, he said, his voice catching. Tessa showed it to me. The receipts, the email, all of it. He paused, swallowing hard, and I could see him searching for words, like he wasn't sure where to start. Why didn't you ever tell me? Why didn't you say anything? I let out a slow breath, my arms crossing over my chest, not out of anger, but to keep myself steady. Because I didn't want to make you choose, I said. I thought if I stayed quiet, you'd figure it out someday. But when you looked at me at your wedding, when you said I belonged in the background, I realized you already had. His face crumpled, just for a second, before he caught himself. He sank onto the couch, his hands running through his hair, and I stayed where I was, giving him space. I didn't mean it like that, he said, but it sounded hollow, like he knew it wasn't true. I thought you were okay with it, you know? You always seemed fine, like you didn't need to be upfront with Mom and Gerald. I shook my head, a small, tired laugh slipping out before I could stop it. Fine? I paid for half that wedding, Callan. I raised you, showed up for every game, every graduation, even when I knew I wasn't welcome. I wasn't fine. I was just trying to keep you from hating me. He flinched, like the words had hit him harder than he expected, and I saw his hands tighten into fists, not out of anger, but like he was trying to hold onto something slipping away. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the coffee table where an empty mug sat from earlier. That letter, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I remember writing it. I was so mad at Mom, at everything. I meant every word. Dad, I wanted to live with you. He looked up at me, his eyes wet but steady. Why didn't you use it? You could have fought for me. I moved in, sitting across from him in the armchair, my hands clasped between my knees. Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to pick a side, I said. I thought if I fought, it'd tear you apart. I wanted you to have a mom and a dad, not a war. But I kept that letter, every day, to remind myself you saw me once. That's why it was in the box, not to hurt you, but to show you I was there, even when you stopped looking. He nodded, slow, like he was piecing it together. The wedding. It got away from me. Mom planned most of it, and I let her. I didn't think about what it meant, not having you up there. I didn't think. He leaned forward, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. I looked at him, my son, sitting there looking smaller than he ever had, and I felt the ache in my chest loosen just a little. I know you didn't, I said, but you do now. He reached out, hesitant, like he wasn't sure he was allowed, and I met him halfway, pulling him into a hug. It wasn't perfect, wasn't like when he was a kid, but it was real, and for a moment, it was enough. We talked after that, not long, but longer than we had in years. He asked about the receipts, about the job I'd taken to pay for his college, about why I'd kept so much from him. I told him the truth, that I'd loved him too much to let him see the mess, that I'd thought it was my job to carry it alone. When he stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to me. Can we fix this? He asked, his voice small. I didn't sugarcoat it. Forgiveness is possible, I said. But trust? That takes time. He nodded, like he understood, and stepped out into the night. I closed the door behind him, the house settling back into its quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I'd faced him, said what I needed to, and for once, he'd listened. The box had done its job, not to break us, but to start something new, even if it was just a crack of light in the dark. The morning after Callan's visit, I woke with a strange mix of relief and unease, like I'd set down a heavy load but wasn't sure what to pick up next. The house was quiet as always, the early light slipping through the kitchen window where I stood, waiting for the coffee to brew. His words from last night kept replaying in my head, his apology, the way he looked at me, broken but honest, asking if we could fix things. I told him trust would take time, and I meant it, but part of me wondered if I was ready to let him try. I'd spent so long being the one who showed up, the one who gave without asking, that letting him back in felt like a risk I wasn't sure I could take. The box had done its work, laid bare the truth I'd carried for years, but it hadn't erased the hurt, not yet. As I poured my coffee, the steam curling up, I heard a car pull into the driveway, the engine idling for a moment before it cut off. I knew who it was before the knock came, sharp and deliberate, the kind that demanded an answer. I opened the door, and there she was, Miriam, standing on my porch like she belonged there, her coat pulled tight against the morning chill. She had that look she always wore when she wanted to seem concerned, lips pursed just enough to hint at sympathy, but her eyes were hard, calculating. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice smooth, like she was doing me a favor by showing up. I didn't say anything at first, just stepped aside and let her in, not because I wanted to, but because I knew this was coming. She walked into the living room, her heels clicking on the hardwood, and stood by the couch, not sitting, like she was too important to settle in. I closed the door and leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting. I wasn't going to make this easy for her, not after everything, not after the wedding, not after the box. "That was cruel," she said finally, her voice low but sharp, like she'd been rehearsing it. "What you did at the wedding, leaving that box, airing our dirty laundry in front of everyone. You humiliated us." I felt a spark of something, not anger, not quite, but a kind of clarity that cut through the fog I'd lived in for years. "No," I said, my voice steady, "you humiliated me for 15 years. I just handed you the mirror." Her mouth tightened, like she hadn't expected me to push back, and I saw her shift her weight, one hand smoothing her coat like she needed something to do. "That's not fair," she said. "I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to make things easier for the kids." I shook my head, a small, bitter laugh slipping out before I could stop it. "Easier? You took the house, the money, their trust. You told them I was the one who left, who didn't care. And I let you, because I didn't want them to hate you. But don't stand here and tell me you were making it easier." She flinched, just a little, but enough to know I'd hit something true. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just looked at me like she was trying to find the old version of me, the one who'd nod and let her walk away clean. But that guy was gone. "I never wanted to take the kids from you," she said, her voice softer now, like she thought it'd make a difference. "You just didn't fight hard enough." I stepped forward then, not close, but enough to make her feel the weight of my words. "No," I said, "I didn't want them to hate you. I fought every day, every payment, every visit, every time I swallowed your lies so they could have a mom they loved. But you? You fought to win, not to protect them." Her eyes widened, and I saw her hand twitch, like she wanted to reach out but didn't dare. "That's not true," she whispered, but it sounded weak, like even she didn't believe it. I could have stopped there, let her leave with her pride intact, but something in me wasn't done. "I talked to a lawyer," I said, watching her face. "I'm looking into every payment I made, college, the wedding, all of it. Not to hurt you, but to make sure the truth isn't buried anymore." She went pale, her hand gripping the back of the couch like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You wouldn't," she said, but it wasn't a challenge, it was fear. "I don't want to," I said, "but I'm done letting you write the story. You don't get to erase me anymore." She stared at me, her mouth opening like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time in years, I saw her without the mask, just a woman who'd played a game too long and didn't know how to stop. I walked to the door and opened it, the cold air rushing in. "We're done here," I said, not cruel, just final. She stood there for a moment, like she was waiting for me to take it back, but I didn't. Finally, she moved, her heels clicking again as she stepped outside. She paused on the porch, turning back just enough to say, "I never meant for it to be like this." I didn't answer. I just shut the door, the lock clicking into place, and leaned against it, my heart pounding but steady. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like mine, like I'd finally claimed it back. I went to the kitchen, poured out the cold coffee, and started a fresh pot, the familiar gurgle filling the silence. Miriam's words kept circling in my head, but they didn't stick like they used to. She'd spent years making me the villain, and I'd let her because I thought it was best for Callan and Tessa. But the box had changed that. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about me, about standing up for the man I'd been all along. I didn't need her apologies, didn't need her to admit she was wrong. I just needed her to know I wasn't invisible, not anymore. As the coffee brewed, I looked out the window at the street, the world moving on like it always did. I'd faced her, said what I needed to, and walked away on my terms. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to live again, and no one, not even Miriam, could take that from me. The morning after Miriam's visit, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, like the fog that had settled over my life was finally starting to lift. The house was quiet, The kind of stillness that used to feel heavy but now seemed calm, almost purposeful. I made coffee, the familiar routine grounding me as I stood by the counter, watching the pot fill. Shutting the door on Miriam yesterday had been more than just ending a conversation. It was closing a chapter I'd let drag on too long. Her words, her excuses, didn't have the power they once did. I'd faced her, said what needed saying, and walked away on my terms. But now, standing in the soft morning light, I knew it wasn't enough to just confront the past. I had to decide what came next, what I wanted my life to be after years of giving everything to people who hadn't seen me. The box had started something, and I wasn't going back to being the guy who stayed in the background. I took my coffee to the kitchen table and sat down, my eyes drifting to a stack of papers I'd left there, bills, receipts, a few old letters I hadn't sorted through. They weren't the ones from the box, but they reminded me of it, of all the proof I'd kept to remind myself I wasn't invisible. I told Miriam I'd talked to a lawyer, and I had, but it wasn't about revenge or dragging her through court. It was about making sure the truth was documented, that the years of payments and sacrifices weren't just erased. I pulled out my phone and dialed my attorney, a guy named Tom who'd been a friend since high school. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm but professional. "Morning," he said. "You ready to go over those numbers?" I leaned back in my chair, the mug warm in my hands. "Yeah," I said, "but I've been thinking. I don't want to sue her. I don't want to fight. I just want to build something better." Tom was quiet for a moment, like he was waiting for me to explain. I told him what I'd been turning over in my head since Callan's visit, since Tessa's tears, since Miriam's weak excuses. I wanted to take everything I'd given, every college payment, every wedding deposit, every late-night shift, and turn it into something that lasted, something that wasn't just about me or my kids. A trust, I said, the idea solidifying as I spoke. Not for Callan or Tessa, not directly, but for their kids, my grandkids. Something that says I was here, that I did right by them, but with conditions. No more giving without accountability. No more being the guy who's forgotten. Tom listened, jotting notes I could hear through the phone, and when I finished, he let out a low whistle. "That's big," he said. "It's not just about money, it's about legacy. You sure about this?" I looked out the window, the street quiet and ordinary, and nodded even though he couldn't see me. "I'm sure," I said. "I'm done being silent." We spent an hour going over details, every payment I'd made, every bank statement, every scrap of proof I'd saved over the years. Tom was methodical, pulling together a picture of what I'd given, not to shame anyone, but to make sure it was clear. College tuition for Callan, tens of thousands over 4 years, paid from a second job I'd never told him about. Wedding costs, catering, decorations, even the band, half of it from my savings, no questions asked. Smaller things, too, like car repairs for Tessa, school trips, braces, all the stuff that added up when you weren't looking. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, like I'd laid out every piece of myself and could finally see it whole. The trust wouldn't be about punishment. It'd be about teaching, about showing my grandkids what it meant to respect the people who showed up for you. If Callan and Tessa wanted their kids to inherit anything, they'd have to acknowledge what I'd done, not with words, but with actions. No more unseen fatherhood. I spent the rest of the day sorting through more papers, pulling out what Tom would need. It wasn't just about numbers. It was emotional, too, like putting my story in order for the first time. I found an old birthday card from Tessa, her handwriting small and careful, thanking me for a bike I'd stayed up all night assembling. A receipt for Callan's first soccer cleats, the ones he'd worn until they fell apart. Each one was a memory, a moment I'd been there, even when they didn't notice. I didn't feel bitter, not anymore, just resolute. I wasn't going to let those moments disappear. The trust would be my way of saying I mattered, not just to my kids, but to the family they'd build someday. I'd give them a chance to do better, to teach their kids what I'd learned the hard way. Love isn't enough if it's one-sided. By evening, I was tired but not drained, the kind of tired that comes from doing something real. I sat back at the table, a glass of water in my hand, and looked around the house. It wasn't much, just a small place with worn furniture and a few photos on the walls. But it was mine, and I'd made it a home even when it felt empty. The box had started this, forced Callan and Tessa to see me, forced Miriam to face the truth, but it wasn't the end. I wasn't just a dad who'd been hurt. I was a man with something to give, something to build. The trust was my decision, my way of taking control, not out of anger, but out of hope. I wanted my grandkids to know who I was, not through stories someone else told, but through what I'd left behind. I stood and walked to the window, the street dark now, a single streetlight flickering at the corner. The world outside was moving on, same as always, but inside, I felt different. I wasn't waiting for Callan to fix things, wasn't hoping for Miriam to change. I was choosing my own path, one where I didn't have to prove myself to anyone. The trust would be my legacy, not just money, but a lesson in what it meant to show up, to be present, to matter. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing something I'd never catch. I was building it, piece by piece, and no one, not Miriam, not the past, could take that away. The weeks after setting up the trust felt like a new rhythm settling into my life, quieter but steadier, like I was finally moving forward instead of looking back. I woke up each morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't had in years, the kind that comes from knowing you're doing something that matters, even if it's just for yourself. The house was still the same creaky floors, same chipped coffee mug, but it felt different, like it was mine in a way it hadn't been before. The box had shaken everything loose, forced Callan and Tessa to see me, made Miriam face the truth, but it was the trust that gave me a path. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was building. And that morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched the sun climb over the neighbor's roof, I knew what I wanted to do next. The money I'd saved for Callan's home deposit, the one I'd planned to give him as a wedding gift, was still sitting in my account, untouched. I couldn't give it to him, not after everything, but I couldn't let it sit there either. It had to mean something. I'd been thinking about my dad lately, a man who'd worked hard his whole life, raised me on his own after my mom passed, and never once complained about it. He wasn't perfect, but he was steady, always there when I needed him, even when I was too young to notice. I wanted to honor that, to take what he'd taught me and turn it into something real. So I decided to start a nonprofit, something small but meaningful in his name, the Ellis Grant Foundation. It'd be for single fathers like me, guys who'd been pushed to the edges of their kids' lives after divorce, who'd given everything but still felt invisible. I didn't have grand plans, just enough to offer a few grants, maybe some legal advice, a place for them to feel seen. The money I'd saved for Callan would be the seed, enough to get it off the ground. I spent the morning at the kitchen table, scribbling notes on a legal pad, ideas for a website, contacts who might help, ways to spread the word. It wasn't about fixing the world, just making a corner of it better. By afternoon, I was on the phone with Tom, my lawyer, walking him through the idea. He listened, asked sharp questions, but I could hear the respect in his voice. "You're serious about this," he said, not like he doubted me, but like he was surprised I'd gone this far. "I am," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I've spent too long waiting for other people to give me a place. This is me making my own." He promised to handle the paperwork, get the nonprofit status filed, and connect me with a guy who'd done fundraising for local charities. It felt real then, not just a thought, but something I could touch, something that'd outlast me. I hung up and stared at my notes, the pages messy but full, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings and calls, accountants, web designers, even a local reporter who wanted to do a story on the foundation. I wasn't used to talking about myself, but I told them my truth, not to shame anyone, but to explain why this mattered. I talked about being a dad who'd paid for college and weddings without a thank you, who'd sat in the back at school events, who'd kept quiet to keep the peace. I didn't name Miriam or the kids, just said I learned what it meant to be erased and wanted to help other guys avoid that. The reporter nodded, scribbling fast, and when the article came out, it was small but honest, with a photo of me standing outside the little office I'd rented for the foundation. I didn't expect much, but calls started coming, fathers, mostly guys like me who'd lost more than their marriages. I listened, offered what I could, and felt a kind of strength I hadn't known I had. One afternoon, I was at the office, really just a desk and a couple of chairs in a strip mall, when I heard the door open. I looked up, and there was Callan, standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, looking unsure. I hadn't seen him since our talk at the house, though we'd texted a few times, short messages about nothing important. I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans, and nodded for him to come in. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the plaque by the door that read, "The Ellis Grant Foundation." He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, and I saw his throat move, like he was swallowing something heavy. "This is what you've done with it?" he asked finally, his voice quiet, almost reverent. I nodded, leaning against the desk. I had to do something for someone who believed in me, I said, meaning my dad, but also myself, the man I was becoming. He walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot, his back to me. I read the article, he said. Saw your picture. You didn't mention me or Tessa, but I know it's about us. I didn't deny it, just waited. He turned then, his eyes misty but clear. I'm proud of you, he said, and it hit me harder than I expected. Those words I hadn't heard from him since he was a kid. I didn't get it before, what you went through. I'm trying to now. I crossed my arms, not to shut him out, but to keep myself steady. That's all I ever wanted, I said. Not for you to feel bad, just to see me. He nodded, and we stood there, not saying much, but it felt like enough. He stayed for a while, asking about the foundation, how it worked, who it helped. I told him about the grants, the stories I'd heard, the plans to grow it slow but sure. When he left, he hugged me, quick but real, and I watched him drive away, the sun low in the sky. The office was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, like I'd built something that mattered. The foundation wasn't just for other dads. It was for me, proof I could take what I'd been through and make it mean something. I sat back at the desk, the weight of Callan's words settling in, and knew I wasn't done yet. There was more to do, more to give, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to be seen doing it. The months after starting the foundation passed faster than I expected, each day blending into the next with a quiet momentum I hadn't felt in years. I woke up early most mornings, the house still dark as I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, jotting down ideas for the nonprofit or answering emails from single dads who'd found our website. The Ellis Grant Foundation was small but growing, a lifeline for guys like me who'd been pushed to the sidelines but still wanted to show up for their kids. It wasn't about fixing everything, just giving them a chance to be heard, to know they weren't alone. The work filled my days with purpose, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for someone else to decide my place in the world. The box I'd left at Callan's wedding had started it all, cracked open the truth I'd kept hidden, but it was what I did after facing Miriam, setting up the trust, building the foundation that made me feel like I was finally living on my own terms. Callan and Tessa had started coming around more, not out of guilt like before, but something closer to understanding. Our visits weren't long or dramatic, just dinners at my place, sometimes a quick coffee when they were in town. Tessa would talk about her job, her plans, and I'd listen, nodding as she laughed about some coworkers' bad habits. Callan was quieter, still carrying the weight of what he'd learned from the box, but he'd ask about the foundation, about the guys I was helping, and I could see him trying to piece together the man I was beyond the dad he'd known. We didn't talk about the wedding much, or the years of distance, but we didn't need to. They were building something new with me, slow and careful, and I let them, knowing trust wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a road you walked together. One Saturday morning, I was at the hardware store, picking up paint for the foundation's office, when my phone buzzed with a text from Tessa. "Got something to show you," it read, with an address for a school not far away. "Art fair today. Can you come?" I smiled, setting the paint cans in my cart. Tessa wasn't one for vague invitations, so I figured it was something special. I paid, loaded the car, and drove over, the spring air warm through the open window. The school parking lot was packed, families milling around with kids darting between booths covered in drawings and crafts. I found Tessa near the entrance, waving me over, her face bright in a way that reminded me of when she was little, showing off a new dance routine. "You made it," she said, looping her arm through mine. "Come on, you've got to see this." She led me through the crowd to a display of artwork pinned to a corkboard, kids' names written neatly under each one. My eyes scanned the colorful mess of paintings and sketches until Tessa stopped and pointed. There, in the middle, was a drawing by my granddaughter, Lily, Callan's daughter, just 6 years old. It was a picture of a man with gray hair and a big smile, standing under a tree with a little girl holding his hand. The caption, in Lily's wobbly handwriting, read, "This is Grandpa. He's a hero." I stood there, staring, my throat tightening so fast I didn't know what to do. Tessa squeezed my arm, her voice soft. "She made it for you," she said. "Told her teacher all about how you help people, how you're always there." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and just looked at the drawing, the simple lines carrying more weight than I could have imagined. Lily ran up then, her ponytail bouncing, and threw her arms around my legs. "Grandpa, did you see it?" she asked, her voice high and excited. I knelt down, pulling her into a hug, and managed a smile. I saw it, kiddo, I said. It's the best thing I've ever seen. She beamed, tugging me to show me more of the fair, and I followed, letting her chatter fill the space where my thoughts were too big to fit. Callan was there, too, standing off to the side with his wife, watching us. He caught my eye and nodded, a small gesture, but enough to say he understood what this meant. I didn't need a big speech from him, didn't need him to say he was sorry again. That drawing, that moment, was proof we were finding our way back, not to what we'd lost, but to something better. Later, when the fair was winding down, I sat on a bench with Tessa, Lily off playing with some friends. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the schoolyard, and I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known was possible. You didn't have to come, Tessa said, leaning her head on my shoulder. But I'm glad you did. I put my arm around her, the way I used to when she was small. Wouldn't miss it, I said, and meant it. We sat there, watching the crowd thin out, and I thought about how far we'd come, and not just from the wedding, but from the years of silence, the years I'd spent thinking love meant staying quiet. The box had changed that, forced them to listen, but it was moments like this, Lily's drawing, Tessa's arm through mine, that made it real. Driving home that evening, the paint cans rattling in the back, I kept seeing that picture in my head, me as a hero, not because I'd done anything big, but because I'd shown up, again and again, even when it hurt. I didn't need the head table at Callan's wedding anymore, didn't need a name card or a toast to prove I mattered. I had a seat at a table that counted, one I'd built with honesty and time, with every choice to keep going instead of giving up. The foundation was part of it, helping other dads find their way, but so was this, my family, my grandkids, the life I was making for myself. I pulled into my driveway, the house dark but welcoming, and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The box had been the start, a silent truth that made them hear me.